Hey, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Nowadays, no one would hire a high school dropout. Many of our clients are huge corporations, so we don't want any high school dropouts. You can go now.
The interviewer told me with a stern expression on his face, pointing silently to the room's door. I felt it was pointless to say anything at this point, so I walked out of the interview room. I couldn't run my late father's factory effectively, and my mother was continually concerned about me. So I wanted to become a full-time employee so she wouldn't worry about me. Just as I was about to leave the company with that thought in mind, someone unexpectedly ran up to me, calling out my name. My name is Ezra Taylor. I was working part-time at a local convenience store and looking for a job to become a full-time employee. I had previously sent out my resume to more companies than I could count on two hands. But I'd been turned down during the application screening process, most likely due to my academic background, and I hadn't been able to gain an interview. As usual, I went back to my apartment where my mother was waiting for me after work. When I opened the mailbox with my room number on it, I found several envelopes. I bit my lower lip and prayed as I opened the envelopes and checked the contents. But they all said I had been rejected after the screening process. I sighed as I read the familiar phrases I had seen so many times. Then, I heard a child's laughter and turned around. There was a boy about 4 years old and a man who looked like his father. Both of them were laughing happily. How lovely. I had a time like that too, Dad. As I thought about it and looked at them, I had a dim memory of the past. When I was a child, my parents ran a factory that made screws and other hardware used in construction. Though we were not wealthy, thanks to my father, who always made the family laugh, and my mother, who was kind and caring, we lived a happy life. When I was a kid, I craved my parents' attention and desired to be with them at all times. After coming home from daycare, I would play in the corner of the factory with all the employees watching over me. Normally, employees would usually call out to me, but one day they seemed to be busy and no one was paying any attention to me. I was feeling lonely, and when I saw my father's big bag, I couldn't stand it and jumped on him. Unfortunately, my father, who was working with a hot tool in his hand, was so startled that he dropped the tool. He swung his arm to brush it off, and the tool flew up in the air for a moment. Then it hit me in the face. The only thing I remember after that is that I cried out in pain. However, as a result, I suffered burns from my left eye to my cheek. My father, who was trying desperately to help me, also suffered burns that spread from his arm to his palm. He consulted with doctors several times, hoping that he could somehow get rid of my burn marks. But in the end, both he and I were left with black burn scars. I'm sorry. If only I had been more careful. I'm so sorry. I recall clinging to my father and crying as he hugged me and apologized repeatedly, tears flowing down his cheeks. After that, I was no longer allowed in the factory. My father seemed to regret that he had inadvertently left a scar on my face. Although my mother would occasionally check in to see how I was doing, spending time at home alone was lonely for me. But every time I saw the burn marks on my father's arms when he came home with a smile on his face, I felt sorry for what I had done to my father, even though I was a child. I never broke my promise not to enter the factory. My friends made fun of me for a while, since the burn marks on my face were so red and obvious. But as I endured it in silence, people around me gradually stopped caring. Then time passed, and soon after I entered junior high school, my father suddenly collapsed. He survived, but he never regained consciousness, and the days passed by. For a while after he collapsed, my mother took the lead and worked with all the employees who had been working with us, and we managed to get by. Due to my father's inability to regain consciousness and the employees' distrust of the factory's management, they gradually quit one by one. Neither my mother nor I could stop them. After 2 years in the hospital, my father passed away quietly without waking up. When it was time to say goodbye to my father, I had no more tears to shed. So I exhaled deeply and made a decision. It's my turn to protect the factory that my dad protected. I will never let it disappear. And so, without even listening to my mother's advice to stop, I decided to work at the factory instead of finishing high school. I hadn't been in a factory since the day I received burn scars, and I missed the crisp noises of metal working and the smell of iron. How I desired to return to the factory where my father acknowledged me as a full-fledged worker capable of taking over his position. But that was no longer possible. I worked hard and patiently rebuilt the factory with the help of the old employees. But a kid with no management expertise could not operate the factory as well as his father. We barely got by on father's life insurance policy and our savings. But we were running out of money. My mother became ill and stayed in bed after nursing my father for a longer period and handling the unfamiliar factory. I believed that the uncertainty of what would happen to the factory due to my unfamiliarity with the company's management was physically and mentally exhausting for her. It became difficult to raise wages for the employees who had worked so hard with us up to that point. In the end, I decided to close the factory full of memories and tears. You all have worked hard together with us. I'm sorry that it came to this. It's all my fault. What are you talking about? You know, when you, someone we've known since you were a child, announced you wanted to work for his late father and us, did you realize how happy it made us? You did enough. Now you have to take care of your mother and live for yourself. I couldn't help but cry at their words. The senior employee smiled gently and patted me on the head, saying I hadn't changed in my whining ways. I have been working hard with their words in my heart. But I was thinking that I would never be able to show my face to my father or those employees again if I continued like this. One day, as I was checking the mailbox as usual, I found several envelopes. To my surprise, I received an interview notice from one of the companies. I did a first bump before hastily opening the door to my house and reporting it to my mother. She grinned happily at me, her face considerably more wrinkled than before. And finally, the day of the interview came. I could feel the muscles in my cheeks tense up with nervousness, and it was the first interview in my life to begin with. I felt my lips trembling as I sobbed up in the waiting room, and I worried whether I could speak well. As I read over and over again the memo I prepared, explaining your reasons for applying for the job and so on, my name was called, and I entered the room where the interview was being held with two other job applicants who were waiting in the same waiting room. As I have simulated many times in my brain, I sat down on a chair after being asked to do so. The interviewer greeted me first with a friendly smile. His name was Logan from the Human Resource Department, who spoke in a brisk tone. Then there was Mr. Jones, the CEO of the company, who spoke calmly. I was even more nervous to see that the CEO was even present, and I froze. Then Logan asked me to introduce myself. I took a deep breath once after the other two, and managed to smile and start talking. However, Logan yelled and pointed out that I had dropped out of high school. Logan seemed to have been listening to my self-introduction while looking at the resume I had submitted. When he reviewed my resume, he couldn't help but speak out. The other job applicants were also looking at me surprisingly. Mr. Jones also looked at my resume and my face alternately and rolled his eyes in panic. While I managed to speak in order to break the silence, Logan came to his senses and coughed loudly. You know what I'm talking about, but nowadays, no one would hire a high school dropout. Many of our clients are huge corporations, so we don't want any high school dropouts. You can go now. With a frigid glare, he whispered to himself, wondering if there had been an error in the screening procedure. I clenched my fists on my knees and managed to keep my frustration to myself. Damn! What is the problem with all of you? How come you just care about one's academic background? Although I was assisted by others, I also have work experience. And how come I'm treated like this? That's what I thought, but I knew it would never reach the hearts of the people in the room. I quietly got up from my seat and left the interview room. As I was walking down the hallway with a sigh, a voice called out to me from behind. I turned around to see Mr. Jones, who had been in the interview room earlier. As I froze in surprise, Mr. Jones stared at me and murmured, "I recognize that scar," and he said with a serious expression, "I'm sorry if I'm wrong. Is your father's name by chance Andrew Taylor?" Yes, that's correct. He passed away, but my father's name was Andrew." When I replied, Mr. Jones wrinkled his brow, mumbled, "I see," and covered his eyes with one hand. I was flustered, not knowing what was going on. Mr. Jones silently shook my hand with tears in the corner of his eyes. "I'm sorry for panicking. Your father saved me." "I see. So he passed away." I was still confused, but Mr. Jones took me to the break room. He told me to wait there and left in a hurry. He probably went out of his way to catch up with me, even though he was in the middle of an interview. I could have just left, but I was concerned about the relationship between my father and Mr. Jones, so I decided to wait quietly. After a while, Mr. Jones returned to the break room with a relieved look on his face that I was still there. He apologized for keeping me waiting and offered me a cup of coffee. After drinking the coffee, Mr. Jones told me a story about where he met my father. When Mr. Jones was younger, he was just another employee scurrying around the manufacturing floor. At one time, Mr. Jones made a mistake in placing an order, which led to trouble involving the entire company. To remedy the issue, he had to place an emergency order for a huge quantity of screws. However, none of the factory didn't take the order because of the extremely short delivery time. Mr. Jones had already visited all the factories he had been in contact with. So taking a chance, he asked my father's factory, with whom he had never done business before, whether they might help him. My father readily agreed to the job. The employees, inspired by him, worked tirelessly for 3 days, even sparing time for sleep, and just in time to meet the deadline. Thanks to this, Mr. Jones could avoid the cancellation of our major business deal. After that, his company officially signed a contract with my father's factory and continued doing business with them. Mr. Jones became close to my father, and they began to talk about their private lives. One day, when they went out for a drink at a bar, Mr. Jones asked about the burn mark on my father's arm that had been bothering him for a long time. "Oh, are you talking about this? This is a reminder to myself. It's to remind myself that I'm an inconvenient father who forced his beloved son to sustain an injury that left a scar. And it's also a reminder of my determination to be a strong father who can protect him." In response to Mr. Jones' question, my father smiled sadly and traced his scar with his palm as he spoke. I didn't remember it, but I'd met Mr. Jones several times when I was a child. As soon as I went into the interview room, he noticed a massive burn mark on my face and realized I shared my father's family name. He was certain that I was Andrew's son since I looked like my father. It was right around the time my father collapsed and was hospitalized. Mr. Jones had also become busy with his new position and had lost contact with him. When he called the factory after everything had calmed down, it was already closed. We had moved out of the house that was nearby. Mr. Jones had been worried about me and my parents for a long time. "Your father, Andrew, really took care of me a lot. Watching him, I felt that he had a wonderful talent that attracted people somehow. He was also very sincere in his work, and he was one of the few people I ever really trusted. But surely you, who have seen Andrew at his closest, must know that better." I stared straight at Mr. Jones, who grinned at me when he said that, and I said, "Yes," firmly. Then, when I finished my coffee, Mr. Jones saw me off as I left the office. I thought that just hearing about my father from Mr. Jones was worth coming to the interview. I walked quickly to the apartment, where my mother was waiting for me. As soon as I opened the front door, I told her about the story Mr. Jones had told me about my father. My mother nodded happily and smiled as if reminiscing about the old days. "Come to think of it, it's been a long time since I've talked about my father with my mother." While I was thinking about that vaguely, I couldn't help but smile at my mother as she talked about the difficulties and joys of running the factory. A few days have passed since then, and just as I was thinking that I would have to start job hunting all over again, to my surprise, I received a letter of employment from Mr. Jones' company. Since the interviewer told me that a high school dropout was useless, I never imagined that I'd get hired, so I was surprised. But anyway, I felt joy welling up from deep within me. When I told my mother about it, she expressed her gratitude to Mr. Jones with tears in her eyes. I earnestly worked every day to live up to the expectations of Mr. Jones, who had hired me. By confronting my seniors directly, even though they initially looked down on me as a middle school graduate, gradually they began to recognize me. Now I am busy working in cooperation with everyone. Then, one day, I was taking a break in the break room where Mr. Jones came in. I greeted him with a smile, and Mr. Jones smiled as well. He said he was glad to see that I was doing as well as he expected, and offered me a cup of coffee. As I gratefully accepted it, I said something I had wanted to tell Mr. Jones for a long time. "Mr. Jones, thank you so much for not judging me based on my academic background and for giving me this opportunity. It was tough at first, but now I am enjoying working with everyone I work with. This is all thanks to you, Mr. Jones, and this company that you have protected." I thanked him. Then Mr. Jones grinned broadly and declared that I was truly my father's son. Thanks to being hired as a full-time employee, my life has become stable. Perhaps because my mother no longer had any cause for anxiety, her health gradually improved. She started working part-time within a respectable range because she was tired of staying at home all the time. In this way, I was able to return to my normal life again. And just like the day my father died, I made a new resolution in my heart. To treasure trustworthy connections with people as my father did, and to continue working with sincerity. I will cherish these feelings and grow into a person who can contribute to the company. I hope that someday, when I reunite with my father again, he will compliment me for my hard work. I looked up at the clear blue sky with this thought in mind. I rolled up my sleeves and walked towards the company, where my colleagues waited for me as usual.